many of us find ourselves practicing alone, perhaps without close contact with any kind of teacher, and I think we'd like some way of understanding progress along our path, some way of understanding where we're going and what we should be looking out for as we progress, as we continue to practice. And so in today's video, I want to go through 6 of what I see are keys to understanding this kind of progress. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So this issue of progress came up for me because there was a recent video here on YouTube by the Venerable Pomyum Sunim, who had a talk over on Buddhist Door Global, where he discussed this very issue. Venerable Pomyum is a Son teacher, that is to say, a Zen teacher in the Korean tradition. And this talk is highly recommended. I'll leave a link to it down below in the notes in case you want to see it, and I recommend you take a look. I'll be compacting his answers a little bit here and adding my own sort of spin on things a little bit. I should also say my good friend Justin Whitaker is over there on Buddhist Door Global giving weekly news bulletins and sort of Buddhist information around the world. So there's a lot to take a look at over there if you want to if you're interested in these kinds of topics. So the biologist Robert Sapolsky has a recent book out called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And I actually talked about that book in a video of mine quite a while back. And in that book, Sapolsky talks about how in the animal world, in the animal kingdom, animals are not stressed all the time. Most of their lives, they're in a relatively low stress level, and they only get stressed, that is to say, ulcers in his description, when they're being threatened, when they're, let's say, an animal, a lion is running after them. I mean, a zebra in its normal time is not particularly stressed. But Sapolsky notes that humans are different in the sense that in the modern world, in our modern society, many of us live a life of constant stress, where stress sort of never lets up. And so keeping that in mind, one of the focuses of our practice, this is what Venerable Pomyum says, and I think he's absolutely right, one of the focuses of our practice is just to reduce that baseline stress level that we all may feel in our ordinary life. So we pay attention to that baseline stress level. This would be the first way of keeping track of our practice, is seeing to the extent that that baseline stress level declines over time. Do we find that we are less stressed nowadays in a general sense than we were before? The second way we can pay attention to our progress here is to pay attention to the times that are more acute of stress. Let's say that we're in a situation that is normally quite stressful. We have to do some project in our job that is difficult, or we're being criticized or berated by our boss or coworker or family friend or something like that. These are situations that I think would stress any of us. And again, we can pay attention to how we are reacting in those kind of situations. How does our stress level react? Do we feel just as stressed as before? Or is our stress slightly less? Now, that doesn't mean that it has to go away completely. We have to be very careful not to be overly ambitious in our understanding of the path. But nevertheless, we can pay attention over the weeks and months and years of practice to see whether we're better able to cope with these kinds of acute stressors than we were before. The third thing we can look at is our outward behavior. Up until now, we've really been talking only about our internal sensation of stress, but now we can also look at how we behave in the world, look at our speech, look at our actions. And as a baseline, we want to keep in mind or keep an eye out over whether we're speaking or acting in ways that harm people or that bother them in some ways. That's the baseline. So are we getting better at this over time? Are we speaking in ways that are less harmful as we progress in our practice. That's indeed a sign of progress, that we're over time behaving in ways that are less harmful, that are less nasty, that are less bothersome to other people. That would be the third. Now, the fourth is to sort of deepen here and go a little bit farther than just the baseline level and ask ourselves if we are acting in ways that are actually beneficial to others. In other words, are we helping others by our speech? Are we helping others by our actions? This, again, goes beyond the baseline because we're not simply asking about harming or lack thereof, but of actual helping. And while, we can live perfectly good lives without harming anybody but not helping either, that, at the end of the day, is a relatively egoistic way of living. It's better, both in a broader sense of society, but it's also better for ourselves if we can help other people. Because I think we'll find over time that actually being helpful to other people makes ourselves happier. I mean, this is something that's actually been discovered in psychology, is that the extent to which we reach out a hand to our neighbors, we actually make ourselves feel better in doing that. Volunteering for a food drive or something can actually make us feel better. We feel better about ourselves too. So this is a fourth way that we can keep an eye on our progress. Fifth, even if we don't do anything outward to harm anybody, even if we are acting in ways that are helpful, we should be paying attention to the character of our own thoughts. Now, this is over and above the stress level I was talking about before, but to ask ourselves, what are we thinking about? What are we spending our time contemplating? Are we thinking about hurting other people, harming them, bothering them? These are, it's difficult for many of us to admit to such thoughts, but it's important to do so. It's important to admit it because only by admitting it can we start working with it. That many of us, and myself included, have thoughts of harming other people. We see somebody doing something bad, we see somebody in the news who is obviously harming lots of people, and we think, I'd like to wring that guy's neck or something like that. You think that way. And even though it's a kind of thought that we may shy away from embracing, nevertheless, we should pay attention to those when they arise in our minds. So this fifth way is to pay attention to the extent that these kinds of thoughts of harming or bothering arise, or conversely, if we're spending our time thinking about helping other people, thinking about compassion for other people, thinking about kindness and being friendly to people. These are obviously much healthier ways of thinking, ways that are not going to burn us out so quickly. And the sixth stage here, or the sixth thing to pay attention to, is the quality, I think, of our anger when it comes up, or indeed our greed as well. Greed and anger being the two states of mind that are generally the most harmful to us in the long term. Pay attention to how those arise. I think that when we begin practice, or even when we don't have practice, we'll find that, let's say, anger tends to arise and persist. We tend to have grudges that we hold over even months or years with other people, that somebody's done us wrong, and so we hold a grudge over a long period of time, or we have some greed that is simply unattainable. In other words, that we hold on to this greed for whatever it is, no matter what happens to us in our lives. A greed for more money, and no matter how much money we make, we want more. However, I think as we progress in our practice, we begin to see that those kinds of negative emotional states of greed and anger decay faster. In other words, yes, we still get angry. We still find ourselves filled with hate sometimes, or filled with greed, but as we practice, we find that those states decay quicker, that the anger doesn't last. It may flare up for a moment, and then 5 minutes later, we find ourselves not angry anymore, or not greedy anymore. We get greedy for something, then we find a little bit later that, we've forgotten all about it. This is another way of paying attention to the progress along the path. Now, it's good to always keep in mind that this progress is going to be slow, that we should not expect a miracle in a day or a week or even a month. These are things that take months and years to actually see real changes in. But I think if we pay attention to this over time, we will see changes if we're practicing in a good way. The main question for Venerable Pomyon is to see under what conditions we can retain equanimity. In other words, how can we expand that role of equanimity in our lives so as to make our lives better, and how, once we've done that, or while doing that, how can we expand our tendency and wish and willingness to help others, both in our actions and in our thoughts. It's these kinds of things that I think over time we begin to see as correct progress along the path. And of course, part of that path is going to involve backsliding. That is to say, time and again we'll think that we're farther along than we really are. We'll go through a period, let's say, of great equanimity in our lives, and we'll think, oh, all of those difficult times are beyond me or behind me. And then all of a sudden we'll be thrust into a new situation that we find difficult. And the tendency can often be to beat ourselves up over that because we think, oh, I thought I was beyond this, foolish me. But that's simply part of practice, again, is understanding that it's slow and that it goes through cycles, although over time the cycles should be getting better. Now, I think it's also interesting to keep in mind the earlier maps of progress that we find, or map of progress that we find in the early suttas. In the early suttas and in, let's say, the school of Theravada nowadays, it's understood that there are generally 4 stages of practice. Now, Venerable Pomyon says in the video that we don't really need to pay too much attention to those, and I think he's right in the sense that the stages of practice seen in early Buddhism, the most famous ones, are really quite far along. They're sort of stacked at the very end of the path for many of us, sort of thing we'll have to see with a telescope, rather than something that's right in front of us. And that's why I think these stages here are these ways of thinking about progress are a little bit easier for us. But nevertheless, it can be useful also to consider these other ways of gauging our progress. And I did an earlier video on these 4 stages of progress that we find in the early texts, and I'll leave a link to it up on the screen here if you haven't seen it or aren't aware of it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, take a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help us out and get something in return. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one.